What if the United Nations was never created? A world without a global peacekeeper. After World War II, the world was left in ruins. Millions were dead, cities reduced to rubble, and economies shattered. The UN was supposed to be a fresh start, a way to prevent another catastrophic war. But without it, what happens? The League of Nations had already failed once, and without a new replacement, the post-war world would have been even more chaotic. Instead of a unified effort to rebuild and stabilize, major powers would have likely gone their own way, forming rival alliances with no neutral ground to mediate disputes. No international mediation, more wars. Without the UN, conflicts like the Cold War might have escalated far beyond proxy battles. The Cuban Missile Crisis could have turned into full-scale nuclear war, since there would be no neutral organization to facilitate negotiations. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, these could have been even more devastating without UN peacekeeping forces attempting to stabilize regions. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Balkans, the Rwandan genocide, these situations, which were already tragic even with the UN, could have spiraled further out of control without any diplomatic intervention. No universal human rights. In 1948, the UN adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a document that set the foundation for international law regarding human rights, equality, and dignity. Without it, many human rights abuses might have gone unchecked. Apartheid in South Africa could have lasted much longer. Women's rights, labor protections, refugee aid, many of these advancements were made possible through UN-backed initiatives. A fragmented global economy. The UN didn't just promote peace, it also helped rebuild economies. Organizations like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and World Bank were heavily influenced by UN-backed policies. Without them, struggling post-war nations might have faced longer depressions and deeper economic collapses. No global efforts on climate change today. Climate change is one of the biggest threats to humanity. And while progress has been slow, the UN has played a crucial role in bringing nations together for climate action. Without it, there would be no Paris Agreement, no coordinated environmental efforts, and likely no pressure on major polluters to reduce emissions. A more dangerous world? While the UN is far from perfect, it has served as a platform for diplomacy. Without it, nuclear non-proliferation treaties might never have been signed. The spread of nuclear weapons could have been even worse, leading to more unstable nations gaining access to devastating technology. One thing is certain, without the UN, the world would be a much more unpredictable, unstable, and dangerous place. So what actually happened? 1945, the birth of the United Nations. A new era begins. By 1945, the world had seen enough destruction. After 2 world wars, millions of lives lost and entire cities reduced to rubble, global leaders knew something had to change. The League of Nations, which was created after World War I to maintain peace, had failed spectacularly. It was time for something stronger, something that could truly prevent another global catastrophe. The road to the United Nations. During World War II, the Allies, primarily the US, the UK, the Soviet Union, and China, began discussing a new international organization that could help maintain peace and security. The idea gained momentum, and in 1941, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill signed the Atlantic Charter, which outlined their vision for a post-war world. By 1943, the Moscow Conference saw the first official mention of creating a new global organization. Then, in 1944, at the Dumbarton Oaks Conference in Washington, D.C., representatives from the U.S., the U.K., the Soviet Union, and China sat down to draft the blueprint for what would become the United Nations. The San Francisco Conference, the birth of the UN. On April 25, 1945, just weeks before Nazi Germany's surrender, delegates from 50 countries gathered in San Francisco for the United Nations Conference on International Organization. Over 2 months, these nations negotiated, debated, and finalized the framework of the UN. The world was still at war. Japan had not yet surrendered, but the leaders knew they had to act fast to secure lasting peace. Then, on June 26, 1945, the United Nations Charter was officially signed by these 50 nations. The United States was the first to ratify it, and on October 24, 1945, the UN was officially established. This day is now celebrated as United Nations Day. The core mission of the UN was built on 4 main goals. 1. Maintain international peace and security, prevent future wars through diplomacy. 2. Promote human rights, ensure basic rights and freedoms for all people. 3. Foster social and economic development, fight poverty, hunger, and inequality. 4. Encourage international cooperation, help countries work together to solve global problems. To achieve this, the UN was given a powerful structure, including the General Assembly, where all member nations have a voice. The Security Council, the most powerful body with 5 permanent members, US, UK, Soviet Union, Russia, China, and France, and 10 rotating members. They decide on military actions, sanctions, and peacekeeping missions. The International Court of Justice, to settle disputes between countries. The Secretariat, led by the UN Secretary General, responsible for daily operations. The UN in action. In its first few years, the UN quickly became involved in major global issues. It played a role in mediating conflicts, helping newly independent nations, and launching humanitarian aid programs. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in 1948, setting a new global standard for human dignity. The UN also sent peacekeeping forces to trouble spots around the world. Challenges and controversies. Despite its noble mission, the UN has faced its fair share of challenges. The Cold War often paralyzed decision-making, with the US and the Soviet Union using their veto powers against each other. Some critics argue that the UN has been ineffective in preventing conflicts, such as those in Rwanda, Bosnia, and Syria. Others believe it has too much bureaucracy and inefficiency. Yet, despite these struggles, the UN remains one of the most important international organizations, playing a crucial role in global diplomacy, humanitarian aid, and peacekeeping. The UN today, from fighting climate change to preventing nuclear proliferation, the United Nations continues to shape world affairs. With 193 member states, it's still the closest thing humanity has to a global government. While it's far from perfect, its existence proves that, despite our differences, nations can come together to strive for peace and cooperation. And to think, it all started in 1945, when a war-torn world said, "Never again."